Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EVN Disrupt podcast. My name is Nejdat Zaturyan. I'm the editor of the creative tech section here at EVN Report. This week, we are continuing our series of podcasts from the Science and Technology Convergence Conference. We were happy to be the media partner of the STC conference, which was organized by SmartGate's Catalyst Foundation, with the support of the European Union and the GIZ Foundation. Our guest today is Artem Harutyunyan. Artem is the co-founder and chief technology officer at Bardeen.ai. Bardeen is a tool that helps automate repetitive tasks and build more productive workflows. Thank you for listening. Artem, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Artem, tell us a little bit about your background and your story in the Armenian tech sector.
Well, I was born and raised mostly in Armenia, started my career in science, moved to Silicon Valley about 10 years ago and started Bardeen about 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Were you working in the Armenian tech sector at all before starting a company? Or?
No, I worked at a research institute here, Yerevan Physics Institute, while I was here. And then I moved to Geneva. I was at CERN for a few years as a senior fellow. And then I moved to the Valley where I worked for American companies.
Right. Tell me a little bit about why you decided to transition from science to the entrepreneurial world.
I think it's a conversation that can take many hours. Yeah. TLDR is that so basically, there were the one kind of the straw that broke camel's back was Marc Andreessen's talk. So I was visiting Palo Alto for a conference, and there was a Y Combinator startup school. So I was there, and they were having Marc Andreessen. So he's known for person who wrote the first commercial web browser.
Right.
And CERN, the institution that I was representing, is known for actually inventing the web.
Right.
So the HTTP protocol and HTML were invented at CERN. And Marc was telling an anecdote from early days of the web where he had to basically convince people at CERN that HTML standard needs an image tag. Mm-hmm. In other words, people at CERN were not convinced that anyone would need images on the web. You know, he told that story, the audience chuckled, and I kind of realized that I'm on the wrong side of that equation.
Right.
So that was, and like half a year later, I was in Silicon Valley.
Right. What type of companies did you work at before starting Bardeen?
My background is in infrastructure, so I always I call it like the plumbing of the internet and the types of things that no one even suspects that are there, but without it, like nothing works. So I always did systems. So I started with operating systems, then I moved to distributed systems. Yeah. So I always dealt with big data, large scale, distributed. So anything, compute, networking, storage. So that's what I did at CERN. And then when I moved to Silicon Valley, that's how I continued. And honestly, I just got tired of it after having been doing that for 20-ish years. I was like, I need to do something else. And then I started Bardeen, and, half a year later, I realized that I'm still doing the same things because people that I knew were like infrastructure people. Right. So I hired a bunch of them. And so we're doing very, very interesting infrastructure work disguised as a prosumer kind of end user product, which is really fascinating for me. So
tell us about the product, Bardeen, and what problem you guys are trying to solve.
The product, it's an automation product. So we basically automate tasks that are mundane, repeatable, and automatable because at some point, I and my co-founder kind of independently realized that we spend a lot of time just basically serving computers. Like imagine so for instance, for your podcast, you need to do research on like whoever you're talking to. And I guess, you go to LinkedIn, you punch in a name, and then if it's interesting, you copy paste the data from LinkedIn too. And then you have to write an email. I'm sure you have a template where you just have to like replace the name and so on and so forth, right? So that's the repeatable part of your daily work that you don't even realize is repeatable. But if you think what's happening is there is LinkedIn, which is a computer system which has its own way of representing data. Yeah. You take that, copy to Google Sheets, which is another computer system. So basically, these two things do not talk to each other. Like LinkedIn does not know how to talk to Google Sheets. But then here you are, like highly intelligent person with like highly valuable time, helping this like two stupid computer systems talk. And that's in essence what we want to solve, right? So, and there's like a myriad of examples in any person's day where they do this without realizing. So we basically reduce that entire workflow of like you're going to LinkedIn, copy pasting to Google Sheets to Gmail. Right now, we reduce it to a click. So you basically can create what we call a playbook that will do that in a click. But the ultimate goal is to basically have someone on your shoulder, like looking over your shoulder, recognizing that these are repeatable patterns in your work, and then suggesting those shortcuts for you. So you don't even need to bother thinking about that and creating those shortcuts. So
what are some of the most common tasks that your customers are automating today? What are you seeing?
The thing is, like everyone's workflows are very similar, but not exactly similar. Right. So if you look at the distribution, it's going to be a very long tail, meaning it's kind of hard to pick like one category and that like prevails. But by and large, I think where we see a lot of traction is, for instance, I call this category list building. So basically what I described in case of, like in your case where you need to research or create some sort of a list for your podcast guests, recruiters do the same thing, business development people do the same thing, lead generation sales do the same thing, like marketers do the same thing when they're researching influencers. So that's one category. The other category is like operationalizing. So here's the thing. I think what with COVID, we have heard about this, like the Great Resignation, right? Where like a lot of people just quit their jobs. And so what happens is one of the big problems that companies have is that, if you have someone who's going to be there for 4 years, it's okay to have them train for 6 months to learn ins and outs of your organization. So if you're hiring a lead generation person, it takes them a lot of time to figure out, okay, what is the right Google Sheet that I have to copy this data to? What is the right Slack channel that I have to drop this message into, so on and so forth. However, if the half-life of your employee is 8 months, you cannot afford to spend 6 of those just to train them, because then that cost does not amortize over time. It's much bigger than a category. It's rather a problem that people solve with tools like ours, where you basically codify that institutional knowledge. Right? So like instead of teaching a person like, hey, these are the 15 Notion documents that you have to bookmark, and these are the 5 Slack channels that you have to drop your messages into, now you create a shortcut. And so when they show up to work, you say, if you see an interesting candidate, if you get a lead, just click this button. And then the magic happens behind the scenes.
So you guys, one of the things that your product can really help out with is making companies, I guess, a lot less vulnerable to high turnover of employees, because some of those tasks are codified in an automational tool like Bardeen.
Yes, spot on. And I mean, that also has a lot of other benefits. For instance, now you ensure consistency, right? Like if you have 5 people who are doing sourcing of candidates for you, now every one of them will do it in a consistent way, meaning they would not forget to also capture like email of the candidate or whatnot. So, and there are a lot of other kind of similar benefits of doing it that way.
So it sounds like a lot of the things that you guys can automate today are based around what data is easily extractable. Is that a fair characterization?
We like to think of ourselves of, the goal is to automate anything that you do in a browser. We support about like 30 applications, like, Slack or like Gmail or Jira, or I call it a hipster stack, that we have like like native integration with, that you can do much more than just extracting data. Like for instance, we can join your calendar, we can join your meetings for you automatically and stuff like that. So we integrate with calendar and whatnot. And for sites that do not have an API, which is the majority of sites on the internet, we have built a way to extract data because we're in the browser. but we're much more than just the data extraction. Yeah.
What are some things that you can automate today that people might be surprised to learn about? And what are some things that are coming, you think, in the coming, let's say 5 years as browser technology develops and just the web moves forward? What are some things that we'll be able to automate in the coming future?
Maybe people get surprised. I bet like a lot of our users get this like wow moment because I'm in it every day. It's like,
it's less shocking for you.
So, but these are things that we kind of mindlessly spend time on without even realizing. Like imagine you have a meeting. I bet some of them are recorded on Zoom. Now, when your meeting is done, you have to share that recording with the people. And so think about everything that you have to do. First, you have to wait for that email from Zoom to come. Then you have to go back, find the meeting on a calendar, create an email to the participants of the meeting, paste the link from Zoom. And so that's something that we have an existing, we call it playbooks, basically. We have a catalog of those automations that you can just enable this with one click. So say, do this for me every time, or do this for me for certain Zoom meetings or whatever. So those are the kinds of things where there are, some cases where people, they just write us thank you emails where they say, hey, I just did something in half an hour that would have otherwise taken me 2 weeks to accomplish, right? Like list building and stuff like that. But by and large, for the majority of users, it's this small, air quote, things that compound over time.
Right.
If you look at the end of the week, you have spent 5 or 6 hours like throughout the week. Maybe none of those would in isolation would be like, oh yeah, this is like this is a nice gizmo. But the real value is like when it compounds.
Right. And what about something in the near future that you think we'll be able to automate?
Well, one thing that we want to automate that is a really hard problem is creation of those automations, basically automating the automation. Because everyone has their own unique workflows. Everyone uses a different combination of the apps. There is it's just combinatorially impossible to come up with all the variations and provide them out of the box. So what we want to do is have this basically synthesize automations for you. So basically you would install Bardeen, maybe you find something from the catalog right out of the box, great. Maybe not. But then 4 days later, you get an email saying like, hey, Najde, we saw that you wasted like 3 hours doing this, 5 hours doing that, and 2 hours doing this. And we synthesized automations for you.
Right.
Here, like, please review them and enable them.
Right.
So that's going to be magic.
Right.
Like
so recognizing what can be automated and
it's it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to do, but
you think that's in like the 5-year time frame or?
No. I mean, not 5 year, no. I don't want to be committing to shipping software while being on record, but it's soon. Let's put it this way. Yeah, it's we already have a working prototype for a few of those tasks. It's hard to generalize because, users have very little tolerance for software being wrong. We don't recognize this, but we've been trained to have a very high standard. So before we roll something out, before we make it generally available, you have to get it it has to work in 9 out of 10 cases.
Right.
So that's what we're kind of working on, perfecting, but we already have something in the
works.
lab. So yeah.
You guys recently announced a funding round. What do you guys have planned for the future of Bardeen?
In terms of funding, we're very well capitalized. We have ridiculously long runway. Hopefully, we will never need to raise capital again.
That's great.
Definitely, I would not want to be raising in this environment specifically.
But you guys probably closed your round right at the right time, right?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
I think had we done it half an hour earlier, it would probably have been even better. But we partnered with an amazing firm. We got a very good, very favorable terms. But when we were closing, we were already hearing the cracks.
Yeah.
But we've been we timed it well.
Right. Anything in regards to the future of the company, expansion plans or product?
We're hiring right now. We're 14 people. Actually,
around the world,
my
right?
grandmother asked me yesterday, it's just where are they from? And
Right.
it's literally all over the world. We have like Colombia, US, Italy, Greece, Germany.
Wow.
We have like Russian. We have someone in France, although she's Russian. So we're hiring very slowly. I think, spoke to, at this point, probably like, I don't know, 90 people easily to hire like 7.
Right.
And out of those 7 was like 4 or 5 were people who I worked with before. So really
Right.
to hire like 2 or 3.
Right.
But yes, I mean, we have a lot of money that we need to spend.
Right.
And most of it is going to be spent on obviously manpower.
Right.
But so yeah, we are expanding.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and let's talk a little bit about STCC. We're here at the conference today. What's your takeaway so far? What do you hope that will come of today's event?
To me, and I have been kind of indoctrinated, I started my career in academia, and Silicon Valley has such strong ties with, it's not a coincidence that Silicon Valley was like, that like Stanford and Berkeley are in Silicon Valley, but
Right.
it's actually the other way around.
Right.
Silicon Valley is where it
Stanford.
is
Right.
because of Stanford and Berkeley. And to me, it's like so blatantly obvious.
Right.
Like, I don't even know what we need to discuss here.
Right.
Like science is it's not just important, it's a necessary prerequisite if we're being serious about anything other than doing just outsourcing and competing with other countries, just not doing very intellectually stimulating work.
Right.
So it's super encouraging to see a number of people and the potential and that we have. I think it's high time for us to graduate from a country where like people just come to outsource to a country where we can really provide, I don't want to say a real intellectual value, because even doing outsourcing is intellectual value. I don't want to diminish the importance or the complexity or anything of it, but I think we need to graduate from there to doing something that provides a different kind of value that's like very, very unique and differentiated.
Right. And I think we've really started to see that over the last 4 or 5 years with the emergence of several deep tech startups in Armenia. And it seems like a lot of the venture capital firms operating here are more and more focused on science-backed startups. And hopefully that number is growing. Yeah.
Yes, and I was talking to, I like to think that I'm pretty well plugged into the Armenian startup ecosystem, and we were actually I was having a conversation with, there were probably like 7 or 8 founders of fairly successful Armenian startups solving hard problems, ML operations, like that sort of stuff. And we just like went around the table. Pretty much every single one of them came from like 3 schools, like high schools. We all went through like 3 or 4 high
Right.
schools. And my question is like, why do we only have 4?
Right.
It's like, it would be super cheap,
Yeah.
like very cheap to have
Yeah.
40 of those high schools, not 4.
Yeah.
And then just like, 20 people from those high schools are going to triple the GDP of Armenia over the next 10 years.
Right.
I promise you.
Yeah.
Of course, like we don't expect high schools to do science, but that's like top of funnel.
Yeah.
I think that's where and that's the easiest part to solve.
Yeah.
So I'm actually looking forward to discussing some like very practical, like, okay, what can we do
Right.
today to,
The most common thing amongst all our podcast guests over the last 7-8 months that we've been doing this, that they graduated from FizMath.
yeah, of course.
yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So let's dive a little bit deeper into, you said that you have some ideas on really things that can, the sort of the 20% that will have the 80% impact on economic growth and development of the scientific sector in Armenia. Let's speak a little bit more about that. What are your thoughts?
I think, if like we're starting from the beginning, I think we have this throughout the years. I don't know, maybe it is because for like 1,000 years we did not have a state, but we seem to have atrophied the ability to think long term. And by long term, I'm not speaking like 200 years, which we should totally do, but 20 years.
Right.
I think we seem to be very reactionary to what's happening, and then we don't learn that well, and we scramble when something happens. It's very apparent, even if like every time there is an attack,
Yeah.
people just get up in arms
Right.
and everyone wants to do something, and then the attack stops.
And the initiatives die down.
Yeah. And then everyone is like back to business as usual. So I think what we should do generally to think about like, okay, let's say in 15 years we want to have X and like work our way backwards, right? And I think we should really start at schools. That's really, really important.
And you're talking like at the high school
High
or
school,
even
yes.
earlier.
I'm talking at high school because if you think about it, we have very good, like outstanding results at the Olympiads and everything. We go to all the Olympiads and we definitely punch above our weight. And those are generally the people, if you look like who is starting companies and stuff like that, those are the ones that end up doing that. I would start there. And again, to me, this is a super easy problem that's like easy.
Yeah.
We know, because like we know a lot of people in this country who can teach high school math and physics and chemistry and biology at a very, very high level. And then with a bit of coordination, we can get those kids to some of the best universities in the world. And again, we have a network there. We have, even here, we have a bunch of professors. I just actually walked out from the talk from like a president of University of San Jose, which is one of the major schools in the Bay Area. So we have the resources, and these are the things. So I think by doing those things, we would solve some of the top of funnel problems. And then we already have, again, a network of scientists who have very good positions in top universities of the world. We don't need them here. We don't necessarily need to bring them all here. And they all want to be involved one way or another. So I think it's like a bit of like, coordination, long-term thinking. And again, we have to think beyond election cycles and political, like, I don't know what's the right institution to think of it and put a policy in place that would be implemented, because we cannot be reactionary. We cannot kind of wake up from like war to war or from attack. And that's not going to work.
Right. So. Actually, you mentioned engaging top professors that we have in the diaspora at different universities. In 2019, I believe, at the same conference, Science and Technology Conference, the idea of biosim was born. So with Professor Gagik Papayan from the University of Maryland, and perhaps today some other ideas will emerge that will turn into startups. But another thing you mentioned was taking some of those top students at these specialized schools and sending them to the best universities in the world. Sometimes there's this discourse in Armenia that the investment in these individual students, which can be upwards of $200,000-$300,000, is not worth it. That investment, that capital, should be focused on improving the system in Armenia. What are your thoughts on that?
That's stupid. I'm sorry. And there are many reasons. First of all, I know a lot of those guys, and I don't know a single one of them who is not contributing that money back. Secondly, that money does not have to come out of like
state budget.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to go around it. Most, like the best schools, they kind of pride themselves on the fact that once you get admitted, like there is no one who is not attending those schools because of a lack of funding. They have super deep pockets. They have very long-term thinking. It's actually funny. I attended Stanford recently, and I was trying to basically reverse engineer the admissions process. Like I was like trying to understand what do you need to be or do so that they like you. And I talked to a bunch of professors and to a bunch of people, and I realized that the criteria that they optimize for, which is super smart when they look at the person, is this person going to enrich our alumni network? When basically that's their kind of thinking, right? So like in 20 years, once this person graduates, what is their potential of being so cool that when someone looks at them, it's like, oh, he
went to Stanford or she went to Stanford.
So that's the kind of thinking that the schools have. They have super deep pockets. And then honestly, there are like hundreds of schools in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in France, and like money is not an issue, is what I'm trying to say. Like it's a very lazy way of thinking that like, oh, let's not even try. Like, I don't know, that's like some sort of like loser mentality. I'm getting angry. It's just like so wrong to think about that. Like, like I promise you, if you get into a great program in some of your in some of those universities, like the universe will manifest that money for you to go there.
Yeah.
Like it will happen.
Even if the universe doesn't, the tax revenue from the startups they end up creating.
Somehow, some
right.
way you will have, like you will find a way.
Just to like one analogy, there are two startups at least, I'll name them, Wirestock and Superannotate, whose founders did a similar program of going to the US for undergrad. And, I'm sure a lot of people went with that program for undergrad studies in the US, and many of them didn't come back or stayed. But just those two coming back and building their companies, the tax revenue generated from that easily covers theirs and several others.
Active loop code signal service type.
It's kind of self-evident, right?
There are a lot of them. And
I also heard this really interesting point once made by an Armenian founder that if you only stay in Armenia and if the only experience you get is from the local Armenian ecosystem, often you won't be able to tackle some of the bigger problems or build the products that gain global traction because you won't see what there is, in the rest of the world, right? So that exposure is super important.
I think we're too much focused on like stay in Armenia part of the... I mean, it's super important to... I call it like maintain presence here. If you were a painter or like an artist during Renaissance, you had to be in Florence.
Right.
If you were Van Gogh, like he had to go to Paris. Even the genius that he was, he couldn't have done it in his Dutch village, and he realized that, and he had to be in Paris to become who he was.
Yeah,
that's okay.
Yeah,
that's fine. Like even people, I was listening to a bunch of interviews with like Alex Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir, a fascinating company, and was co-founded by Peter Thiel, who himself, by the way, is German.
Right.
And he was talking about like a German diaspora in Silicon Valley.
Right.
And like Germany is arguably one of the most developed nations, cultures there is. And it's okay. That's how the world works.
Yeah.
And like, going there doesn't mean like cutting ties or anything. You have to do this.
Yeah.
Like you cannot, there is no one place. Even Silicon Valley, like it's not American. People don't realize it. It's probably more American than anything else, but it's not American. It's a melting pot where like everyone comes, including the co-founder of like Superannotate,
right.
And everyone else. I'm also part of the statistic, So that's okay. And some of them will stay, some of them will come back, but it's a numbers game.
Right.
It's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future.
Yeah.
Like you don't know what's going to happen, so it's like spray and pray.
Yeah.
Again, I have not met a single person from Armenia or of Armenian descent who at least does not have an intent of doing something good for Armenia.
Yeah, I completely agree. If you send 100 kids to Stanford, and even if only 10 of them come back or are directly engaged in some really impactful way in Armenia, it's way better than having none, right? So.
And send them to UC or Irvine or anywhere. Yeah. Like, they don't all need to go to Stanford. It doesn't, or like send them to some school in France or Germany. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of them are definitely going to do something great and like come back and,
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Artem, this was super fascinating. I think we could go on for a few more hours. But
easily.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.